At the U.S. Capitol, in front of 12 million live viewers, Jasmine Crockett and Paul Gosar go head-to-head in a vicious showdown over one explosive question. Is free speech fueling domestic terrorism? Gosar shouts, blames the left, and calls her a disgrace. But just minutes later, Crockett drops a bombshell. Riot footage synced with Gosar's own voice and a rioter's chilling confession in court. Gosar is hit with a second ethics investigation, and his political career goes into freefall. What did she reveal that made America hold its breath and turned a congressman into a national scandal? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building hadn't been this full since the January 6th hearings, and yet today felt heavier, sharper, as if the oxygen itself had grown dense with tension. Press crews lined the walls, security doubled, and in the center, two chairs facing each other across a narrow wooden table, like pistols laid on velvet. The topic was simple on paper. Is speech violence? The role of leadership in preventing radicalization. But everyone in the room knew it wasn't just about ideas. It was about blame, about blood, about the cost of unchecked rhetoric, and whether the men who helped ignite the fire would finally be held accountable. And sitting in one of those chairs, unblinking beneath the glare of 1,000 cameras, was Paul Gosar. He entered like a man immune to shame, stone-faced, jaw clenched, briefcase in hand. Behind him, aides whispered and straightened papers, but Gosar didn't acknowledge them. He didn't need to. This was his theater, his war. And the man who once posted a cartoon of himself slashing a sword through a fellow congresswoman's neck had returned, unapologetic. As he adjusted his microphone, the buzz of the room dimmed. His defenders saw him as a martyr of free speech. His critics saw a coward hiding behind the Constitution. But just as the silence began to settle into comfort, another figure stepped into the light. Jasmine Crockett, calm, precise, radiating something no camera could fully capture, the weight of truth sharpened by fury. Unlike Gosar, she didn't play to the cameras. She didn't need theatrics. Her presence was disruption enough. A black woman from Texas, young, unbent, and utterly unafraid, stepping into a room designed to silence people like her. The moment her heels touched the floor, the air shifted. Reporters stopped mid-sentence. A staffer dropped a pen. Gosar glanced sideways and for the first time all morning, blinked. Jasmine took her seat across from him, placed a thin folder of documents on the table, and folded her hands like a surgeon before the first cut. No greeting, no smile, just silence. And then Chairman Welby spoke. This hearing will now come to order. And as the weight of the chairman's final words settled over the room, something colder began to rise, an arrogance wrapped in a suit, seated across from principal. Paul Gosar adjusted his mic, not to offer clarity, but to rewrite the cost of his own cruelty. He leaned forward with the slow composure of a man convinced he was untouchable. "Let me be clear," Gosar began, voice low and deliberate. "I do not take responsibility for how others interpret a video." The statement hung in the air, leaden and hollow. Around him, cameras clicked, eyes narrowed, but he remained unfazed. It was art, symbolic, political commentary, no different than a protest sign or an editorial cartoon. He paused, letting the words linger. Then came the dagger cloaked in reason. Anyone who believes it incited violence should consider whether they simply misunderstood the message. He was, in effect, not just defending the video, he was defending his right to imagine violence against colleagues without consequence. A still frame flashed in everyone's memory. Animated Gosar, sword drawn, lunging at Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, her body split in stylized blood. That image had sent death threats flooding into AOC's office. But to Gosar, it was just a metaphor. No apology, no reflection, just a shrug behind the shield of the First Amendment. The disregard wasn't just strategic, it was surgical. Then came the part that made the room physically shift. Gosar straightened in his chair, and with a voice carefully pitched to sound reasoned, said, "And let's talk about January 6th. A murmur rippled through the gallery. His eyes swept the panel, then locked briefly on Jasmine Crockett. The people involved in Stop the Steal weren't rioters. They weren't criminals. They were patriots, misled maybe, but patriots nonetheless. The silence that followed wasn't from agreement. It was from disbelief. Gosar kept going. They believed what millions of Americans still believe, that their voices were ignored, their votes dismissed, and their institutions compromised. He painted them as victims, not of propaganda, but of betrayal. They acted out of love for country, not hate. Across the chamber, one of the Capitol police officers visibly tensed. This was the same man whose colleagues had been beaten with flags, whose blood still stained those very marble steps. Gosar ignored it. "If we're going to sit here and pretend they were terrorists," he added, "then we're criminalizing belief. And if belief becomes a crime, then none of us are safe." The framing was deliberate, turning sedition into sentiment. It wasn't just historical revisionism, it was dangerous absolution. And Jasmine? She still hadn't spoken. Not because she lacked a response, but because she knew. The more he revealed himself, the less she'd need to say to bring it all down. Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to argue ideals. She came to expose consequences. And when rhetoric turned violent, she didn't offer opinion. She offered evidence. With a calmness that betrayed the weight of what she was about to reveal, Jasmine turned toward the committee clerk. "Roll it," she said quietly. The screen behind her flared to life, pulling every pair of eyes toward it. There was no narration, no explanation, just sound and image, raw and deliberate. A pounding, almost militaristic soundtrack set the tone. Heavy drums, distorted strings, the kind of music used in movie trailers before a final kill shot. And then it began. The animated version of Paul Gosar appeared, sprinting across rooftops, his weapon gleaming. The target, a female figure in white, unmistakably Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Seconds later, in one brutal stroke, the sword slashed through her. Her animated body collapsed in a spray of stylized red. No symbolism, no nuance, just death. Delivered in high definition. The scene didn't stop there. As the video continued, Gosar's character turned toward a caricatured version of President Biden, lunging with the same blade raised. Another beat of music, another moment of violence. Then the screen went black. The silence that followed was unnatural. A room once filled with coughing staffers, clicking pens, whispered side comments, was now frozen. No one moved. Not a breath, not a blink. Even Gosar sat stiff, as if bracing for something he couldn't spin away. Jasmine waited. 3 seconds, then 4. Only when the tension had soaked into the wood grain of every desk did she speak. That, she said, was not political art. That was not parody. That was a digital simulation of murder, posted by a sitting member of Congress using official resources. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Let me ask you something," she continued, locking eyes with the Republicans across the aisle. "If someone animated themselves killing you and then broadcast it to millions, would you still call it freedom of speech?" She paused. "Because when it's us, when it's women, when it's people of color, it suddenly becomes satire. It suddenly becomes too sensitive to call what it is, a threat." She placed her palm gently over the closed folder of printed threats, but she didn't open it. "You want to know what happened after that video aired?" she said, her tone tightening. "AOC received over 3,000 new threats in 72 hours. My staff had to install a second security camera at their homes. A man was arrested with weapons in his trunk. He told police he was inspired by what he saw." She looked down, just for a second, then back up. "So don't tell me it was a metaphor. Metaphors don't send people to the hospital. Metaphors don't leave bullet holes." Her final line didn't come with fire. It came with weight. This is not about censorship. It's about consequences. And when we normalize the fantasy of killing each other, especially when that fantasy comes from this building, we're not just playing with politics. We're playing with matches in a room full of gasoline. She sat back, eyes steady. And in that moment, it was clear. The room wasn't silent because of the video. It was silent because everyone had just seen exactly what she meant. She let the weight of her last words linger, gasoline and matches, before she reached again for the folder. But this time she didn't pull out threats or transcripts. She pulled out names, receipts. "And if anyone still believes this was just a video," she said, voice steady, almost too calm, "then let me show you what came after the camera stopped rolling." She held up a printed email. Not speculation, not a headline. Documentation. This message was sent directly to Congressman Gosar's office, 3 days after his video went viral. She turned it outward so the panel and the public could see. At the top, in bold font, "From America First Foundation." She began to read, not for effect, but for evidence. "Congressman, thank you for using your platform to help us reach a broader audience. Millions saw the video. You helped shift the narrative in ways we couldn't have achieved alone. You've proven yourself a true ally. We look forward to working with your team again." Jasmine stopped there. She didn't need to embellish. She didn't need to raise her voice. The words had already done their damage. "That," she said softly, "is what it looks like when hate thanks you for your service." She placed the page down like a verdict. And that isn't some anonymous troll in a comment thread. That's a national extremist network with a documented history of radicalizing young men toward violence. But the paper trail didn't stop at the inbox. She reached again, this time lifting a high-resolution still image. It was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. For those unfamiliar with America First, let me remind you who signs their invitations. She turned the photo to face the panel. Paul Gosar, smiling behind a podium stamped with the AFPAC logo, arms raised mid-speech, bathed in stage lights. "This is the congressman," she said, "speaking, not just attending, at the America First Political Action Conference. Not a fundraiser, not a policy forum, a platform built by Nick Fuentes, a man who has denied the Holocaust, called for a dictatorship based on race and religion, and praised the January 6th insurrection as the beginning of something beautiful." She let the silence hang heavy again. Not dramatic silence, moral silence. A kind of stunned stillness that made the walls feel too close. "And Congressman Gosar didn't walk off that stage," she continued. "He walked into it. He gave them legitimacy. He gave them credibility. And in return, they gave him applause." Her voice was colder now, more precise. "Let me say this plainly. You don't get to claim ignorance when you stand beside fire and hand it a microphone." Her eyes swept the panel, then fixed back on Gosar. "The people who chanted 'Jews will not replace us'? They call you a champion. The people who want my colleagues and I silenced, exiled, or worse? They see you as their weapon, not because they misunderstood your message, but because you echoed theirs." She placed the photo face down, next to the printed email. "So no, this isn't guilt by association. This is guilt by alignment, by presence, by praise." She took one last breath, grounding herself, not in anger, but in purpose. "And while my staff sleeps with panic buttons under their beds, you're getting fan mail from the architects of their fear. That is not freedom of speech. That is an alliance. And this chamber, this country, we have to decide today if we're still willing to pretend we can't see it." She sat back in silence, not because she was finished, but because the truth had spoken for her. And no one, not even Gosar, was willing to look up. The room had held its breath too long. After the evidence, the photos, the emails, the curtain had dropped. For a full minute, nothing moved. The silence wasn't peace, it was pressure. And in that pressure, something inside Paul Gosar finally gave way. He didn't just shift in his chair, he exploded from it. "This is a coordinated attack," he barked, voice louder than it had been all morning. His hand hit the table hard, not enough to break it, but enough to send a cold ripple through the microphones. Staffers blinked. Some instinctively leaned back. "You think I'm going to sit here and let you people paint me as some kind of extremist?" He spat, eyes now locked not on the chairman, but on Jasmine Crockett. "I see what this is. I see it clearly. This isn't about violence. This isn't about videos. This is about targeting white Christian conservatives who won't bend to your agenda." The tension snapped like a bone. Journalists in the gallery leaned forward. Gosar was no longer testifying. He was unraveling in real time. "This isn't justice," he growled. It's a political assassination dressed in woke theater. His voice had lost its polish. Every word sounded like gravel chewed between teeth. You take a cartoon, an exaggerated metaphor, and twist it into a criminal confession. But the real extremists? The ones burning cities, tearing down monuments, threatening the very foundation of this country. They're your allies. And they sit in this very chamber. He gestured vaguely, theatrically, as if every progressive member of Congress were suddenly an enemy combatant. No one interrupted. Not yet. And don't pretend this is about safety, Gosar continued. Because if you cared about threats, you'd be looking into the violent rhetoric coming from your side. He reached into his own stack of papers, crumpled, uneven, printed from blogs no one in the room recognized. Here, he said, flinging one page in the air like a courtroom stunt. Here's a headline, Whiteness is Violence. Here's another, We need a revolution against cis-hetero-capitalism. You don't think that's hate speech? His voice cracked but didn't falter. You don't think that radicalizes people too? Still, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't lean back or lean in. Her composure was a weapon sharper than anything he had brought to the table. Gosar saw it and hated it. She sits there like some holy arbiter of morality, he sneered, now pointing directly at her. But what has she done besides race bait, besides fan the flames of division and call it justice? His finger trembled, just slightly. Every time someone like me speaks plainly, people like her cry victim. That's the new game, isn't it? Manufacture outrage, weaponize identity, accuse, 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 and never once answer for the poison you've put into this country's bloodstream. There was a beat, one of those impossible seconds where the room goes completely still, but the noise in your chest is deafening. Then he went further. Let me read you something, Gosar said, his voice dropping to something more guttural, as if lowering it made it more true. He pulled another printout, this one from a known conspiracy site, its logo half cut off at the top. If you're white, Christian, and proud, you're the enemy now. He slapped the paper down like it was gospel. That's what this is. This isn't about my video. This is about erasing people like me from public life. This is about making us afraid to speak, afraid to exist. A low murmur spread across the hearing room. Not support, not protest. Just the sound of people realizing they were watching something that had crossed from defense into delusion. Gosar wasn't finished. I've served this country longer than some of you have been able to vote, he growled, and I won't apologize for defending its principles. Not to you, he said, gesturing again at Jasmine, and not to the mob that wants to turn dissent into a crime. His voice cracked again, not from emotion, but from the strain of holding together a crumbling narrative. And still, Crockett said nothing, because she didn't need to. In fact, her silence only made it worse. The way she sat, steady, hands folded, eyes calm, it was the mirror he couldn't break. The contrast between her poise and his panic was unbearable. She wasn't shaking, he was. She wasn't flailing, he was flinging paper. She wasn't claiming victimhood, he was begging for it while drowning in privilege. And the room saw it, maybe for the first time, clearly. This is a disgrace, he finished, his words now hoarse, ragged. A disgrace to the institution, and a disgrace to every American who's ever been silenced for speaking the truth. But the truth wasn't on his side anymore, because long before he'd raised his voice, Jasmine Crockett had already raised the evidence. Because before he'd thrown papers, she had already laid down facts. Because before he'd claimed censorship, she had already proven consequence. And because now no one could unhear what he'd said, no one could unsee how he tried to flip the script, not by disproving a thing, but by screaming that the villain was the victim all along. Only the villain had written the script, and the victims had simply read it aloud. Gosar's outburst had left the room scorched with accusation. But what Jasmine did next wasn't retaliation. It was surgical. And this time, the scalpel was video. Without raising her voice, without changing her posture, Jasmine turned to the clerk and gave a quiet instruction. Play the second clip. The screen behind her flickered to life, bathing the hearing room in the harsh light of January 6th. The grainy footage began, familiar, yet always jarring. Protesters turned rioters, barricades collapsing under the weight of fury, a sea of flags, fists, zip ties. But this time, it wasn't just the chaos that played. Over the footage, layered like a score to a war film, was Paul Gosar's own voice. Not edited, not manipulated, just timed, exactly as it had happened. They've stolen your vote. The criminals are inside the Capitol. We must fight like our republic depends on it, because it does. The words weren't describing the violence. They were narrating it. Every phrase landed in lockstep with broken windows, with bodies breaching the rotunda. It didn't feel like watching history. It felt like re-experiencing an ignition point. The room had gone utterly still. Even the clicks of journalists' keyboards had stopped. The screen went black. Jasmine stepped forward, not for show, but for clarity. Her voice, calm and unsparing, cut straight through the silence. That, she said, gesturing toward the still dark screen, was not incitement in theory. That was incitement in practice. That is what it looks like when rhetoric becomes gasoline. She opened a manila folder. No dramatics, just evidence. From it, she pulled a transcript, legal, sealed with court record numbers, time-stamped and certified. "I'm going to read you the sworn testimony of one of the rioters," she said, her eyes moving from the page to the faces of the committee. "This is from Federal Case 22 CR 1129, United States versus Parker." She read with slow, deliberate precision. "I wasn't planning to go inside, but I heard Congressman Gosar speak. He said our leaders were criminals and that it was time to act. I believed him. I believed we were taking our country back." Jasmine let the silence breathe for a moment. "That man is now serving a federal sentence, but I want us to consider what he was really confessing to." She placed the transcript on the desk. "He wasn't just admitting to a crime. He was revealing a cause." She turned toward Gosar, who for the first time had stopped shifting. His hands were no longer moving. His eyes were trained ahead, somewhere past her, somewhere past accountability. "You say you were just giving a speech," she continued, "but your words didn't live in isolation. They traveled. They multiplied. They marched." She pointed gently toward the screen, as if the image were still burned there. "When people smashed those windows, they believed they were answering a call. When they built gallows outside, they believed they were fulfilling a mission. Your voice didn't echo. It directed." Her tone tightened now, not louder, sharper. "And that is why this hearing isn't about metaphor. It isn't about censorship. It's about consequence." She stepped back behind the table, placed both hands on its edge, and spoke the line that would echo far beyond the walls of the Capitol. "Your words, Mr. Gosar, didn't just inspire violence. They authored it. They set the scene, cast the enemy, and opened the curtain. What followed wasn't protest. It wasn't confusion. It was the first chapter in the playbook of domestic terrorism." She sat down with no flourish, no nod for approval, just gravity. And in that moment, the silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was judgment, not hers, the room's, the nation's. The kind of silence that comes when something undeniable has finally been named. Jasmine's final line had dropped like a gavel, undeniable, unflinching, and razor sharp. But the silence that followed didn't hold. Because in rooms built to protect power, truth doesn't end the storm. It unleashes it. The eruption came all at once. A wave of shouting crashed over the chamber like a violent tide. Republican lawmakers, red-faced and flustered, slammed fists on desks and demanded decorum. One rose to his feet, pointing toward the screen that had just played the Capitol riot footage. "This is a smear campaign," he barked. Another accused the hearing of being a show trial run by socialists. Order evaporated in seconds. The chairman pounded his gavel 3 times, 4, but his voice was buried beneath the chaos. Cameras shook. Staffers looked up from behind laptops with visible alarm. On one end of the room, a security aide instinctively stepped closer to the dais. But the center of the storm was Paul Gosar. He stood slowly like a man who didn't care about rules anymore, who believed rules no longer applied. His chair scraped back against the floor with a sharp, guttural screech. His face was flushed a deep red, his eyes wide and burning with something far beyond indignation. This wasn't strategy. It was rupture. He jabbed a finger in the air toward Jasmine. "You are a disgrace," he shouted, voice cracking with rage. "You sit here and slander a man's name on national television. You don't represent justice. You represent vengeance." He took a step forward, ignoring the chairman's voice, ignoring the rules of protocol. "You are the shame of this institution," he hissed, finger still extended, now trembling with the sheer fury behind it. "You think waving around a few court transcripts and biased videos makes you righteous?" His voice was rising to a near scream. "You think that makes you better than me? You're a fraud, a liar, a parasite wearing a congressional pin." Gasps echoed from the back of the room. One Democratic aide clutched a hand to her mouth. Others sat frozen. It was no longer a hearing. It was a confrontation on the edge of collapse. The tension was physical, suffocating, hanging in the air like static before a lightning strike. And still, through it all, Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. She sat completely still, her face unreadable. She didn't flinch when Gosar pointed, didn't blink when he called her a disgrace. Her hands rested on the table, composed, as if holding something heavier than fury, authority. Then slowly, with the precision of someone who knew every eye in the nation was watching, Jasmine reached toward the microphone. Not abruptly, not theatrically, just decisively. She pressed the button and spoke. "You can yell," she said softly, but with steel woven through each word. "But I have evidence." The words landed with more force than any gavel. They cut through the shouting like a blade through smoke. Gosar stood there, still seething, but his power was slipping, because she had just done what he couldn't, named the line, and stood on the right side of it. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, enough for the camera to capture the full measure of her stare. "I didn't call you a traitor," she said. "You did that when you stood beside men who would burn this democracy to the ground if it meant keeping their power." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You call me a disgrace for showing the truth? You call me a parasite for refusing to be silent?" Her tone was calm, but her cadence had sharpened. "If telling the truth is disgraceful, then you've made your peace with lies." The room began to still, not out of order, but awe. She kept going. "I didn't manufacture the videos. I didn't write the emails. I didn't storm the Capitol. Your own words did that. Your allies did that. And when they did, they carried your flag, quoted your speeches, and thanked you afterwards." She paused, let the silence fill back in. "What I did was read, present, play the tape. And you know what terrifies you most?" Her eyes narrowed. "That the country saw it too." Gosar didn't respond, not because he couldn't, but because in that moment, there was nothing left to hide behind. His fury had done what Jasmine's evidence hadn't needed to. It proved she was right. She sat back again, microphone still on, but she said no more. And in that long, hard silence, you could feel the shift, not just in the room, but in the story. The balance had tipped, and it hadn't been rage or volume or spectacle that moved it. It had been a woman who refused to scream back, who held the receipts and the line, and let a man's own fire burn the ground beneath him. Jasmine didn't just win that exchange, she ended it. The air was still charged from Jasmine's final words. Words that had exposed more than conduct. They'd exposed complicity. And in that charged silence, all eyes turned, not to Gosar, not to Crockett, but to the chair at the center of the storm, the committee's neutral voice, now forced to choose. Chairman Wallace adjusted his glasses with hands that trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what was coming. For most of the hearing, he'd remained quiet, measured, his gavel a formality. But now, after hours of evidence, after a chamber nearly collapsed under its own fury, he leaned forward. And when he spoke, the entire room leaned with him. "This committee has reviewed video evidence, public statements, official court documents, and material communications between a sitting member of this body and known extremist organizations," he said, voice steady but thick with gravity. "The conduct displayed, both before and during this hearing, raises serious concerns about ethics, judgment, and the safety of this institution." He looked directly at Gosar, who still stood, lips pressed into a thin line. "It is the chair's recommendation that a formal referral be made to the House Ethics Committee for immediate investigation into potential violations of the standards expected of members of Congress. A gasp rippled through the chamber. One aide in the gallery dropped their pen. The chairman wasn't done. "This motion will be entered into the record now," he continued. "All members present may indicate their assent or dissent. The chair now calls for an official vote." For a moment, the room hesitated, not from indecision, but from shock. This wasn't symbolic. This was procedural, real. A formal ethics investigation, on record, against a sitting Republican congressman, again. And not just for past conduct, but for what had just unfolded live on national television. Then the votes began. One by one, names were called. Representative Simmons? Aye. Representative Lynn? Aye. Representative Delano? There was a pause. Congressman Delano, Republican from Ohio, staunch conservative, usually welded to the party line, looked down at the table. He didn't blink, didn't speak right away. And then, into the mic, he said just one word. Aye. The room shifted. That single defection cracked the shield that had protected Gosar for years. This wasn't partisan theater anymore. This was accountability, and it had just crossed the aisle. Gosar's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. He couldn't, because this wasn't coming from the radical left, as he liked to say. It was coming from inside his own flank, from a man who had voted with him 96% of the time, until today. Chairman Wallace gave a final nod. The motion is adopted. The recommendation will be transmitted to the House Ethics Committee before close of business. He banged the gavel once, sharp and final. And with that single strike, the story changed. Within minutes, phones buzzed, screens lit up. Reporters scrambled from their seats, already typing the headline before they reached the hallway. Breaking! Ethics investigation launched into Gosar's conduct. Second inquiry in 2 years. Major outlets picked it up within seconds. Social feeds lit like wildfire. Networks broke into programming with chyrons running bold across the bottom. Gosar under investigation. Again. Inside the chamber, the noise of the press was deafening. Cameras turned not to Gosar, but to Jasmine Crockett. She sat quietly, her eyes forward, saying nothing. She didn't need to speak anymore. The vote had spoken, the gavel had answered, and the headlines were no longer hers to write. They were his to answer for. But still, the moment wasn't about punishment. It was about reckoning. About what happens when accountability, long denied, finally demands a seat at the table. And in that moment, surrounded by the noise of a nation watching, Jasmine remained exactly what she had been from the start. Unshaken and right. The vote had passed. The gavel had fallen. But what happened next didn't unfold inside the marble walls of the Capitol. It erupted far beyond them. The hearing may have ended, but across America, the battle had just begun. Within moments, the digital floodgates burst open. Clips from the hearing, Jasmine's voice slicing through chaos, Gosar pointing and unraveling, the damning video over Capitol riot footage, began circulating at the speed of rage. On TikTok, teens were remixing her words into protest anthems. On Twitter, journalists fired off threads like rolling thunder. And across every screen in the country, 2 hashtags exploded onto opposite ends of the internet. Stand with Gosar, a rallying cry for those who saw the hearing as a leftist ambush on conservative identity. And words have consequences. A banner carried by millions who had watched a black woman sit through shouts and smears and answer them with truth so precise it made a room go still. The divide wasn't quiet. It was visceral. On the far-right corners of social media, conspiracy pages cried censorship. Gosar's defenders labeled him a martyr for free speech, a victim of radical race politics, and posted clips of him yelling as proof of righteous indignation. One caption read, "They want to silence real Americans." Gosar stood his ground. Another, "This is about erasing white Christian men from politics." The comments poured in by the second, furious, tribal, defiant. But that wasn't the whole country. On the other side, a different kind of fire had been lit. Jasmine's composure, her control, her unwillingness to flinch in the face of raw aggression. It didn't just resonate. It reverberated. Her words, "You can yell, but I have evidence," became a rallying cry for everyone who'd ever been shouted down, talked over, or dismissed. On Instagram, artists painted her in courtroom armor. On YouTube, a live stream titled Jasmine Crockett, "The Moment She Changed the Room," gained 1.2 million views in 12 hours. And by midnight, major celebrities had joined the chorus. Ava DuVernay posted, "What Jasmine did today wasn't politics, it was history." Kerry Washington, "Every young girl watching knows what power looks like now." But it wasn't just celebrities watching. In a high school gymnasium in Dallas, Texas, several hundred miles from D.C., the news broke in the middle of fourth period. A history teacher rolled in the television cart, old school and buzzing, just in time to replay the vote in Jasmine's final words. A hush fell over the room, the way it only does when teenagers realize they're watching something real. Not rehearsed, not detached, but live, raw history forming right in front of them. When it ended, the teacher turned down the volume. She asked the room softly, "What stood out?" There was silence. Then a voice from the back. A sophomore girl, brown-skinned, hair pulled back tight, eyes sharp, raised her hand and said, "I want to be like Jasmine Crockett." The room turned toward her. She didn't flinch. She didn't scream, the girl said. She didn't run. They tried to embarrass her, and she just showed them who they were, with facts, with calm. She didn't make it about her. She made it about the truth, and she won. I want to do that. I want to sit where she sits. The teacher didn't interrupt, and for a few long seconds, no one in that gym made a sound. Because they all felt it. The way that moment had crossed state lines, political lines, generational lines, and planted something. A kind of courage that didn't need volume or permission, just clarity. Across the country, that story was repeated 1,000 times over. At a community center in Detroit, a woman stood at the mic during open forum and said, "I've been quiet at my job for 5 years, afraid to speak up. After watching her today, I'm done being silent." In a church basement in New Orleans, a young man held up a transcript from the hearing and said, "This is how we fight. With our words, our records, our evidence, not with fists, not with lies." And on college campuses from California to the Carolinas, student unions gathered to rewatch the hearing, not as homework, but as blueprint. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just dismantled a narrative, she had demonstrated something far more radical, that dignity, when weaponized by truth, is louder than rage. Still, the backlash continued. Conservative talk shows framed the hearing as a liberal theater of humiliation. One anchor called it a character assassination campaign orchestrated by radical progressives who hate America. Another claimed, "This is the beginning of a new McCarthyism, only this time, you're guilty if you speak out while white." The narrative snowballed, fed by echo chambers and fueled by grievance. But it couldn't drown the other side, because for every talking head defending Gosar's fury, there were students watching Jasmine's restraint. For every post calling her angry, there were millions who saw focused. For every comment labeling her as divisive, there were black girls in living rooms across America whispering, "That's what strength looks like." And the beauty of it? She never asked to be a symbol. She came with a folder, with facts, with receipts. She sat through slander and shouts and firestorms. And when it was her turn to speak, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. So while the hashtags clashed and the media frenzy grew, and pundits scrambled to spin the outcome in every direction, they couldn't undo what had already happened. Because what Jasmine Crockett did that day didn't just shake a hearing room, it moved a country. The hearing was over. The headlines were written. But what remained, what lingered, wasn't a verdict or a vote. It was a question hanging in the soul of the country. And days later, when Jasmine Crockett sat in front of a national television audience, she answered it not with fire, but with clarity that cut deeper than any flame. The lights in the studio were dimmed to a soft glow, the backdrop quiet, no flags, no scrolling tickers, just a darkened set, a single chair, and a woman who had become a symbol by refusing to perform. Jasmine Crockett sat across from the anchor, Back straight, hands folded, no notes, no pre-written speech. She didn't need a teleprompter. She had been living this truth for years, and now the world was finally listening. The host leaned forward and asked what everyone had been waiting to hear. Congresswoman Crockett, after everything, after the attacks, the threats, the fallout, how do you feel about what happened in that hearing room? Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't pause for breath. Her answer came as if it had been living in her chest since long before that gavel fell. I think people confuse freedom with immunity, she said, voice steady and quiet. They think that just because they can say something, it means they're free from what it causes. But words carry weight. And when you're elected, when you speak from that kind of platform, you're not just expressing opinions. You're giving orders without uniforms. The host didn't interrupt. Jasmine continued. Free speech does not mean free harm, and yet we've built a culture where people think shouting fire in a crowded democracy is a right, not a weapon. That's what I confronted in that room. Not just one man's anger, but an entire system built to excuse it. Her voice didn't rise, but her words did. They climbed into the air with the precision of law and the power of lived experience. I wasn't there to silence anyone. I was there to show what happens when speech isn't used to inform, but to ignite. And if some people think I was too direct, too bold, then I ask them this. Who's really hurting democracy? The person exposing violence or the one encouraging it from behind a podium? The studio was silent. The audience behind the camera wasn't breathing. She looked into the lens, not just at viewers, but at a nation trying to decide what it wanted to become. I didn't walk into that hearing to start a war. I walked in to stop one that's been raging in silence for too long. A war waged with lies disguised as opinion, with slogans used as shields, with platforms built not to protect freedom, but to weaponize it. She paused just for a breath, then looked directly into the camera. Let's be clear, she said. Free speech has never meant free hate, and the moment we treat it like it does, that's the moment we lose everything this country is supposed to stand for. Outside the studio, Twitter was already ablaze. View counts ticked upward like wildfire on a dry field. Newsrooms cut into scheduled broadcasts. The quote had landed, but Jasmine wasn't done. The anchor, visibly moved, asked one last question. You've said before that the Capitol changed that day. Do you believe it changed for good? Jasmine didn't hesitate. I do, she said, because once truth is spoken without apology, it can't be unheard. That hearing wasn't just about evidence. It was about courage. And courage, real courage, doesn't show up screaming. It shows up with receipts. It sits through disrespect without retreating. It names what no one else wants to admit. She leaned back slightly, not for rest, but resolve. And I don't care if I was called names. I don't care if my voice made people uncomfortable. If standing for truth makes you the enemy in a room of cowards, then so be it. I'll wear that label, proudly. The screen faded to black. Her face lingered in the final frame, calm, unshaken, unapologetic. And then across the screen, the final line appeared in stark white letters. And from that moment on, Congress was never the same again, because one black woman dared to stand and won with the truth. Fade to silence, but the echo would last for years. The moment Jasmine Crockett's interview ended, the reaction didn't roll in. It erupted. Her final words had landed with surgical precision. Free speech does not mean free harm. If standing for truth makes you the enemy in a room of cowards, then so be it. The screen faded to black, but the country didn't. Online, it was as if someone had thrown a lit match onto a field soaked in gasoline. The firestorm was immediate, and it had two faces, fury and reckoning. The backlash came first, loud, coordinated, and vengeful. Right-wing media platforms flooded the airwaves. Pundits labeled her performance choreographed defamation, emotional blackmail, and a masterclass in woke weaponization. One conservative senator tweeted, Jasmine Crockett thinks emotion replaces evidence. This is why Congress is broken. Talk radio lit up with outrage. Hosts played sound bites of Jasmine's calm voice, edited next to alarms, chaos, and distorted images of riots, all to stoke the same narrative. She was dangerous. She had gone too far. The attacks weren't only verbal. Within 24 hours, Jasmine's office reported more than 350 threats, voicemails with veiled lynching references, emails that used her photo as target practice, overlaid with crosshairs, Twitter mentions filled with racial slurs. One message simply read, "Silence her before she breaks the rest of us." Her staff had to reroute their personal phones. Security was increased at her district offices. A black SUV was spotted circling her home more than once. Her family, already used to a low level of background tension, now lived under direct and heightened surveillance. Capitol colleagues from her own chamber called for censure. One congressman said she had damaged the reputation of the institution. A senator questioned whether her mental temperament met the requirements of federal leadership. Pundits called her shrill, hysterical, too aggressive. Others leaned into the old script, angry black woman. But even as the fire of outrage burned, another fire was starting, one they couldn't control. It began with a single clip. Jasmine sitting still as Gosar screamed, her hands folded, her voice calm. "You can yell, but I have evidence." Someone posted it on TikTok, layered with soft piano music. It got 800,000 views in 3 hours. Another version put her audio over footage of women from the civil rights era, Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Angela Davis, and added the hashtag "words have consequences." That one went viral in under a day. Then came the response videos. A young woman in Milwaukee fighting back tears said, "I've sat in rooms like that, not Congress, but meetings, jobs, family dinners, where someone tries to crush you, not with facts, but with volume. And you just sit there hoping the truth is enough." Watching her, I felt seen. Another woman stitched the video with a selfie in her scrubs. "I'm a black nurse. Today I watched a black congresswoman do what I do every day. Stay calm while someone tries to unravel me. Jasmine, I see you." Teachers played the hearing in civics classes. Professors broke down her rhetorical structure on whiteboards. Debate coaches told their teams, "Study this. This is how you disarm noise with truth." Young girls posted themselves reciting her words as affirmations. "You can yell, but I have evidence." It became a mantra for anyone who had ever been gaslit in public and expected to stay polite. And then the movement expanded. In Newark, a pastor rewrote his sermon. "The stone the builders rejected became the cornerstone." That's Jasmine. In Oakland, a mural appeared overnight on the side of a community center. Jasmine's face in grayscale, eyes calm, microphone in hand. Above the phrase, "Silence is strategy. Evidence is power." In Detroit, a group of teen girls started a campaign called "Number I Am Prepared," encouraging young black women to speak confidently in spaces that weren't built for them. It wasn't just admiration, it was activation. People weren't responding to a politician. They were responding to what she represented. Someone who had stood in the line of fire and refused to blink. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't insulted, she hadn't needed to. Her stillness had exposed everything, and the world saw it. The hashtags began to trend in direct conflict. Stand with Gosar versus words have consequences. The former fueled by grievance, white fragility, and the fiction of victimhood. The latter grounded in reality, fact, and a demand for accountability. It was no longer just a political hearing. It was a national referendum on who gets to tell the truth and who gets to define its cost. By the third day, even the mainstream media caught up. Anchors played split screens. Gosar's finger-jabbing fury versus Jasmine's calm takedown. Editorials asked hard questions. Are we finally ready to admit that speech can harm? What Crockett showed us about composure and power. One late-night host said it best. If you want to know the difference between ego and evidence, just watch that hearing. She didn't come to perform. She came prepared. But perhaps the most powerful echo didn't happen on national television. It happened in a high school gym in rural Texas. A teacher had played a portion of the hearing for her students. After it ended, she asked them what they thought. A 15-year-old girl stood up, dark curls pulled into a bun, notebooks pressed to her chest, and said, "I want to be like her, not loud, just ready, just unshakable." The room was quiet. The teacher, holding back tears, said nothing. Because that moment, unscripted, unrehearsed, captured what no pundit could spin. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just spoken truth to power. She'd spoken it in a way that taught others how to do the same. And for every smear, every headline calling her divisive, every voice yelling that she had gone too far, thousands of voices now whispered something louder. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. So yes, the backlash was real, predictable, even vicious. But so was the shift. And this time, it was irreversible. 3 days had passed since Jasmine Crockett's televised interview, and still, America hadn't moved on. That, in itself, was a disruption. Usually these moments flicker and fade. Today's outrage becomes tomorrow's footnote, and truth, however raw or powerful, drowns beneath the churn of scandal and spin. But this wasn't like the others. Jasmine hadn't delivered a viral zinger. She delivered a reckoning. And when she looked into the camera and asked, "Who is really hurting democracy?" the country didn't just hear her, it felt her. In that moment, something shifted. And across living rooms, offices, schools, even church pews, millions turned inward to confront what they had just witnessed. Not noise, not theater, but a mirror. It began quietly in spaces that don't usually host political debate. In a barbershop on Chicago's South Side, the TV played the interview on loop. At first, the barbers and clients laughed at Gosar's unraveling, shaking their heads. But then Jasmine's line played again. Free speech does not mean free harm. One man, a retired postman, leaned back in his chair and said, "She didn't just speak for Congress. She spoke for all of us who've been told to sit down and take it." No one disagreed. In Seattle, a group of teenagers who had never watched C-SPAN in their lives stitched her quote into a video essay project for English class. The teacher hadn't assigned it. They chose it. One girl narrated over the clip, "This is what it looks like when someone speaks truth not for applause, but because silence would be violence." In a synagogue in New Jersey, a rabbi paused mid-sermon and rewound the live stream of the hearing. She pointed at Jasmine's calm face as Gosar shouted at her and said, "This is what spiritual courage looks like. Dignity in the face of contempt. Stillness as resistance." And then, a ripple inside the unexpected. In Amarillo, Texas, at a town hall hosted by a local school board, mostly conservative, mostly white, an elderly woman raised her hand during the public comment period. She held up a newspaper clipping with Jasmine's photo on the front. "I never agreed with her politics," the woman said, "but when I saw her sit through that abuse and answer with facts and composure, I thought, that's the kind of spine we used to value in this country." There was silence. No applause, just nods. Honest, stunned nods. Cable networks didn't know what to do with it. The usual commentators tried. One anchor called her a polished provocateur. Another insisted this was identity politics weaponized through performance. But even as they said the words, the footage contradicted them. Jasmine hadn't shouted. She hadn't pointed. She hadn't even raised an eyebrow. She'd sat. She'd listened. And then when it was her turn, she told the truth like it was a closing argument at the trial of a nation that had finally run out of excuses. It wasn't just the content, it was the contrast. In an era when volume wins airtime and rage goes viral, Jasmine Crockett did something revolutionary. She refused to perform. She dismantled an entire ecosystem of noise by refusing to shout above it. And in doing so, she didn't just win a hearing, she shattered a norm. That night in a Brooklyn apartment, a father of two played the clip on his phone while his young daughter sat beside him. After it ended, he turned to her and said, "You know why she's powerful? Because she knew they wanted her angry, and she didn't give it to them." The girl looked up. "She didn't even blink," she said. "No," her father said, "she didn't." In Los Angeles, an acting class dissected Jasmine's hearing like a monologue. The instructor called it the most masterful use of pause I've ever seen on camera. One student said, "She let the silence hang like a question you couldn't escape." Another whispered, "She reminded me why I got into this in the first place." But perhaps the most jarring moment came from the other side of the aisle. On a conservative podcast, two former campaign strategists debated her performance. The first insisted it was manipulative, calculated. She knew exactly what she was doing, he sneered. The second, quiet at first, responded with something unexpected. Yeah, she did. She brought proof. And we brought posture. That's why it landed. We keep yelling about being silenced, but maybe we're just finally being heard and not liking the reflection. It was subtle, but it was spreading. A local TV station in Birmingham ran a segment titled Composure as Protest, What Jasmine Crockett Showed America. In D.C., a museum curator contacted Jasmine's team asking for permission to archive the hearing transcript and microphone footage in their civic justice collection. In New Orleans, a jazz musician sampled her voice for a new track titled Evidence. The spoken word hook, "You can yell, but I have evidence." But beyond all the reactions, beyond the media, the memes, the murals, there was something else, something deeper. Reflection. For a brief moment, the country looked in the mirror and saw its own dissonance. How it rewards rage but fears conviction. How it uplifts chaos but punishes control. How a woman who did nothing more than sit still, armed only with truth, had shaken the entire foundation of a system that had grown comfortable ignoring voices like hers. Jasmine didn't shout down a man. She forced a nation to face itself. And the question she left in the air, who is really hurting democracy, was no longer rhetorical. It was an indictment, and millions were still trying to answer it. Not with slogans, not with party lines, but with silence, with stillness, with a new understanding of what it truly means to tell the truth when it costs you something. Because that night, the country didn't just hear Jasmine Crockett, it saw itself. And not everyone liked what they saw. But even as the headlines faded and the social media waves receded, something far more lasting remained. A lesson not printed in policy or etched into law, but written quietly into the conscience of a nation still grappling with the difference between noise and truth. There is a moment in every story when the action ends, but the meaning lingers. When the lights dim, the crowd disperses, and what's left behind is not applause, not outrage, but a question. Jasmine Crockett didn't just walk into a hearing to challenge one man. She walked into a system designed to outshout her, outnumber her, and outrank her, and still she made truth louder than power. That is the lesson, not in what she said, but in how she stood. Surrounded by microphones, pointed fingers, historical silence, and generational weight, she didn't flinch. She didn't swing. She didn't fold. She simply endured. And in enduring, she exposed something far bigger than a lie. She revealed the high price of dignity in a room that had long forgotten its worth. It is tempting to see her as exceptional, as a singular force of nature. But the deeper truth is more confronting. She is not alone. She is the face of every woman who's ever been told to lower her voice to be heard, of every Black professional asked to prove twice as much for half the credit, of every child who grew up believing that composure was not a luxury, it was a shield. What Jasmine endured on national television, others face in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in classrooms, every single day. She didn't just bring evidence into a hearing. She carried lived reality into a space designed to deny it. And when she spoke, she didn't just speak for herself. She stood on the shoulders of every person who ever swallowed their pride to protect their purpose. The human lesson, then, is not that truth wins because it is louder. Truth rarely wins that way. Truth wins when someone is willing to hold it steady in the face of collapse. Jasmine showed that. She didn't outshout her opponent. She outlasted him. Her silence became strategy. Her restraint became resistance. And in a culture addicted to instant outrage, she reminded the world that the most revolutionary thing you can do is not lose your center in the middle of someone else's storm. But there's a darker lesson too, one the nation must sit with. It should not take this much grace to be believed. It should not take this much calm to be respected. It should not take this much pain to be heard. Jasmine faced a room stacked against her, not just in party lines, but in posture, in legacy, in expectation. She walked into that chamber not as a blank slate, but as a projection screen for everything this country still fears in a black woman. Brilliance, confidence, boundary, and she carried that burden with more control than should ever be required of one person. The unfairness of that, the cruelty of it, must not be romanticized. It must be confronted. Because while Jasmine may have turned fire into clarity, no one should have to. And yet that's where the real moral clarity shines. Because she did. She did it with hands that didn't tremble and a voice that didn't rise. She did it with receipts, with precision, with courage sharpened by generations of silence. And in doing so, she left behind a roadmap, not for how to win arguments, but for how to live with principle in a world designed to test it. This is the human lesson. That strength is not the loudest voice in the room. It is the voice that chooses to speak even when it knows it will be attacked for doing so. That truth is not the prettiest story. It is often the most inconvenient. That justice doesn't always roar. It sometimes waits in silence and then speaks with devastating calm. And most of all, that history isn't changed by spectacle. It's changed by moments like these. Moments where one person refuses to lie just to make the world more comfortable. In the end, Jasmine Crockett didn't walk out of that hearing with just political capital. She walked out with something rarer, moral clarity. She became the person in the room who didn't just speak, but meant it. And when the cameras shut off, when the headlines moved on, that clarity remained. It remained in every viewer who whispered, "That's what courage looks like." It remained in every student who saw for the first time that truth doesn't require volume, it requires conviction. And it remained in every person who's ever been told to sit down and decided, instead, to stand. So if the country learned anything from Jasmine Crockett's moment, it is this: that in the face of injustice, you don't always have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you fight it with facts, with posture, with presence. And when you do, when you stand your ground with your whole self intact, you don't just tell the truth, you change the temperature of the room. But if Jasmine's story taught us anything, it's that truth alone is not enough. It must be defended. It must be carried forward. And now, it's our turn. This isn't the end of a hearing. It's the beginning of a reckoning. Because what Jasmine Crockett endured in that chamber, the jeers, the dismissal, the weaponized silence, was never meant to be personal. It was systemic. It was scripted, and it was designed to outlast her. But she didn't just survive it, she flipped the script. And if we're watching from the sidelines, stunned into silence by her composure, we're missing the point. This moment doesn't belong to her alone. It belongs to all of us who say we believe in democracy, but forget it's something we have to protect. Not just with votes, but with volume, with vigilance, with voices that show up when the cameras are off. Now is the time to speak up, in school boards, on ballots, in workplaces, and in policy. To call out lies when we hear them. To demand consequences when leaders cross the line. Because if one woman can shift the room with evidence and resolve, imagine what we could do if we all stood beside her. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.